In this lesson, we'll learn how we can start to build meshes around our RealFlow particles. Okay, so for this example, I have a couple of containers of liquid that have been set up here. Now, if I were to press the A key and start my simulation, you can see that we have some liquid that is pouring out of this top container and down into the second one. So we'll go ahead and just let this simulate through for a few frames. And if we were to zoom in on this, right now we've only been working with these particles. Now, as far as rendering is concerned, if we actually want to take this simulation back into our primary 3D application, we will typically want to actually generate some kind of a mesh around this. So again, this is going to be a very, very important process when it actually comes time to rendering this. So to actually generate our mesh, what we can do is just start by selecting our emitter up here at the top. If we pull down this little green sphere icon, we really have three different options. We have our particle mesh for render kit, which this is actually something that you would utilize inside the RealFlow render kit, and we do actually discuss this in our course on RealFlow render kit. Below this, we have our particle mesh standard, and then we have our grid mesh. Now, we'll talk more about grid mesh in our next lesson, so we're going to focus on this middle option, this particle mesh standard. Let's go ahead and click on that. You can see here's our particle mesh that's been added into our nodes list. Now, if I click on this little plus icon next to it, you can see our circle emitter is right underneath that. So it's already been connected to this particle mesh. Now, if I had multiple emitters in my scene, or if I wanted to choose a very particular emitter to actually connect to this, what we could do is right-click on this particle mesh and go to Insert Emitters. And if we have a certain emitter that we want to add in here, we can just choose that and then press OK. Now, in my case, that actually just disconnected that, so let me go ahead and reconnect my circle emitter. There we are. And we can actually have multiple emitters underneath here if we want them to all be sort of meshed together as one. So to actually see this mesh, there's a couple of different ways. If we're still in the process of building it and then previewing, what we could do is just right-click on this particle mesh and go to Build. So we'll give this just a moment. And you can see here's our mesh that's been built up. So we could select this and set this to maybe a smooth shaded view. And there's our mesh that's been generated around our particles. Now, there are actually quite a few settings in here that govern the overall look of this mesh, and these options are actually split apart into a couple of different areas. First is if we actually select this particle mesh, we do have options for some of the build options as far as our polygon size, which basically is our resolution. We also have a few options to control the smoothness and some of the relaxation of this mesh. Now, we also have some options that are found underneath the emitter itself. So if I select the emitter that's underneath our particle mesh, we do have some options in here like field, deformation, and so on. So let's start in here with this particle mesh. Now, as I mentioned, we have the polygon size, which really you can think of this as being the overall resolution of your polygons. So by default, RealFlow will try to choose a value that is pretty acceptable for you, and usually it does a pretty good job of this. Now, if we want to, we could come in and override this. So if I were to set this from 0.03, maybe to something a little higher like 0.05, and now come in, right-click, and once again, Build to force that update, you can see now my polygons are quite a bit larger than what they were before. Now, if I wanted to capture maybe some more resolution or get something that is a little bit smoother, I could start to take this down even lower. So lower polygon size really means more polygons overall. And again, if I rebuild, you can see that now my wireframe is much, much more dense than what it was before. And with this actual mesh selected, if you take a look up here, we can actually see the vertex as well as the face count for this mesh. So in this particular frame, we're looking at about 174,000 faces. Close to 175,000 actually. Now, looking at this mesh, you can see that while it is relatively smooth, it also looks very, very blobby. It really doesn't look like a very natural fluid. So a couple of different ways of fixing this. One is to actually come in and start to introduce something called relaxation. Now, this relaxation can be found if we actually select the mesh itself, go over to the filters and expand this section, and by default, this relaxation is turned off. So let's go ahead and enable my filter. Let's just see what this looks like with some of the default settings. So once again, to introduce these new changes, we need to come in and always make sure that we rebuild this mesh. Okay, And with these default relaxation settings, you can see already this makes a pretty significant difference. So instead of this very blobby result, you can see it's actually come in and tried to sort of smooth some of these areas out. Now once again, if I were to select this, we can start to introduce higher or lower relaxation values, just depending on what we need. Typically, you'll find that some of these default settings work pretty well, but as we start to gradually increase this from the default 0.1, maybe to something like 0.2, we should start to see where that smoothness starts to become even more apparent. And really this relaxation value is pretty sensitive, so you'll find that pretty small values will give you some pretty significant results. So really increasing this relaxation is probably one of the single most important ways, or one of the single easiest ways to start to eliminate some of that blobby result that we would initially start to get. Now some other really important options that we have in here, these can be found underneath the actual emitter itself. So if I select this, this is where we have things like the blend factor as well as the radius. Now this controls a couple of very, very important things. So in order to generate this mesh, essentially what RealFlow does is around every particle it generates this sort of a sphere type mesh. So this radius really controls the overall size of those individual spheres that are generated around your particles. This blend factor controls how fluidly those spheres start to blend together in order to get this final result. So what we should start to see is if we were to take this blend factor down to a very, very low value, and then once again build this out, you can see that we start to get these really, really kind of small little pieces within our mesh. Now, in my case, this is probably being influenced by this relaxation. Now, if I were to turn this back off and now rebuild, we should see these individual spheres much more clearly. So there we go. We can actually now see those. So once again, if I were to go back to my circle here, once again, this radius essentially just controls how large these individual spheres are. So if we start to find something that is maybe taking up too much volume, or we need to occupy a little bit smaller volume, we can start to take this radius and begin bringing this down. So I'll take it from something like 0.02 to maybe something like 0.015. And once again, rebuild that. You'll find that, again, some of these very, very small values will have a very, very significant impact. So you'll want to drop some of these options down in very, very small increments. So once again, once we have some kind of a radius defined, we can then come in and start to set our blend factor. Again, the default value of 95 tends to work pretty well for most situations. So you won't typically have to find yourself deviating from that too much. And then once again, we can come in and start to turn our relaxation back on by re-enabling this filter. And once again, build that out. And there we go. So really, these are some of the most important options that you'll need to be aware of. Your basic mesh resolution, the relaxation of that mesh, as well as the actual blending and the radius of these individual mesh pieces. Now below this, again within the emitter itself, if we go into the deformation, we do have some options for speed stretching and speed flattening. Now these could be used to add just a little bit of extra realism to your actual mesh itself, so we can actually force some of these particles that are moving at a certain speed to actually have the mesh kind of stretch out and deform in those areas. Again, just kind of simulating the effect of speed within these areas. Now this is a portion where something like this particle tooltip actually comes in pretty handy. So let's say we actually wanted the particles that are sort of right in this area to introduce a little bit more speed stretching. Well, we define the speed stretching by actually setting some kind of a speed that the particle has to be moving in order to start this stretching process. So how do we actually know how fast these particles are moving, so that way we actually know what value to put in here? Well, again, this is where this particle tooltip actually comes in really, really handy. So if I enable this, I can then come in and hover my cursor over a set of particles. Let me actually make sure I have these particles active. There we go. And you can see this little pop-up that we see. So in my case, this particle that I'm hovering over, if you look at my speed, we have a speed of about 1.7. So I can come in and start to compare that to some of these others. So again, a speed of about 1.0, up here. Again, just hovering my mouse. Over here we have a speed of about 5.7. So it looks like in my case, probably something between 3 and 5 is really where I want this speed stretching to happen, or the speed of between 3 and 5. So let's go in and I'll just click on that particle tooltip once again to disable that. So let's come in, let's enable our speed stretching. For the minimum speed, we'll set this to 0. And for this maximum speed, we'll set this to something like 5. So that way, once the particles are moving at a speed of 5, they have the maximum amount of stretching introduced. Now, another important thing that we need to do is set the minimum and maximum stretching. So minimum scale of 1, which means basically these will be unaffected as long as they are moving kind of around this speed. A maximum scale, we can set the maximum up to a value of 2. So now, once these particles start to reach a speed of 5, this mesh will start to be stretched by a factor of 2. So once again, right-click and build. There we are. And now you can actually start to see where some of these particles are moving a little bit faster. We start to see more of this kind of elongated stretching that begins to occur. And again, it just kind of gives us a little bit more of a realistic resemblance of speed and movement. Okay, now a couple things I want to talk about before we wrap up this lesson. One is the fact that sometimes as you're starting to come in here and build your meshes, you may find yourself in a situation where maybe your particle simulation just isn't quite right. Maybe you actually want to come in here and make some adjustments to your actual particle simulation. Well, right now, if I were to reset my simulation, just press Ctrl A on my keyboard to reset, and if I were to press the A key to resimulate, what we will start to see is that while our particles are resimulating, RealFlow is also rebuilding this mesh at every frame. Now, I may not necessarily want to do that because we are basically right now wasting calculation time to rebuild this mesh on every frame when really I'm not even sure if at this point this is what I want. So if you don't want your mesh to be rebuilt every frame while you're doing your simulation, what we can do is come in, go to our particle mesh, and where it says build, we can set that to no. And now if I reset my simulation and resimulate, you can see now it's just resimulating the particles. It's not rebuilding that mesh. Okay, so once we have our particles set up, let's say we've made really any adjustments that we want. Now we're ready to begin our mesh generation. So once we have this set up, again, all of our particles have been simulated. So what we can do now is basically go back to the beginning of our timeline. Let's go back to our mesh, set the build back to yes, and now we can use this option right up here, which will allow us to come in and basically start to build meshes over this cached information. So you can see now it's going to go through and very quickly generate this mesh now without having to come in and resimulate the particles. So we'll give this just a moment to finish out here. Okay, and there we are. So now we can actually see this mesh for our entire sequence. Now, really, RealFlow will treat these meshes in exactly the same way it treats particles. So if I were to go into my meshes directory for my current project, you can see now we actually have a new mesh for every single frame of our animation. So at this point now we could just simply take this mesh and then import that mesh sequence back into our primary 3D application. Okay, so really it's just going to be a process or a matter of just going back into our primary 3D app, and if we have the RealFlow plugin installed, we should be able to come in and just simply import this mesh sequence directly in. So once again, we can go back to our scene file, into the meshes directory, choose our particle mesh, import. All right, and just go ahead and create that. Now if we scrub through our timeline, you can see here's our mesh sequence. So there's our entire animation. Right, so that's a look at how we can start to generate meshes around our RealFlow particles and then actually bring those back into our primary 3D application for rendering.